right, good evening, everybody. It's time for us to begin. Just very brief with the announcements tonight. Don't have much to announce. Just a reminder to everyone about we need those pictures for our new photo directory. And so if you haven't had a chance to get those in, please try to do that as quickly as you can. Also, Marvin asked if we would to please remember Miss Brenda Estes in our prayers. Next Wednesday, she's going to be having some knee surgery, and so she certainly will need our prayers in that regard. She's staying in right now just to make sure that she doesn't catch something else leading up to that as well. So we want to be prayerful for her that all will go smoothly there. If you know of any other updates or additions or changes that we need to make to our prayer list, be sure to get with me or tonight, and we'll be sure to make those changes in the bulletin. Tonight, our opening prayer will be led by Kenneth Monroe. Dakota Betts will be leading us in our singing, and at the appropriate time, Stanley Childress will lead us in our closing prayer. So let's all join in together.
Number 77. 7-7. Anywhere but Jesus, I can say we go. Anywhere He leads me in this world, we know. Anywhere without Him, dearest joys full of faith. Anywhere with Jesus, I am not afraid. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may carry me, He is still my own. Though His hand may lead me over dreariest ways, anywhere with Jesus is the house of praise. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus over land and sea, telling souls in darkness of salvation free. Ready as He summons me to go or stay. Anywhere with Jesus when He points the way. Anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Number 531. 531. I care not today what the morrow may bring, if shadow or sunshine or rain. The Lord I know will forever be king, and all of my worry is vain. Living by faith, yes, living by faith.
pray with me. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come giving Thee the thanks that we're able to come and gather here to worship Thee in song and spirit. We ask Thee to be with us tonight, that we might open our minds and our hearts, that we might gain something that can enrich our life here on this earth. We ask Thee to be with Brother Brent as he talks with us and gives us Thy message that Thou hast left for us in Thy book. Help him as he looks at those words, that he might present them in a way that be simple for us, that we might be able to understand and gain from it. We ask Thee tonight to be the ones that are asked for the prayers. Help them in some way that they might be able to go through their ordeals and their tests and all things that's going on with them. Help them that they might be brought back to their wanted place in life, if it be Thy will. We ask Thee to be the ones that have lost loved ones. Give them comfort and understanding in their time of sorrow. We thank Thee for the Bible, the plan of salvation, and the hope of eternity after death. We ask Thee to be with the elders and the deacons. Help them as they go through their duties and the decisions they made. Help them they may look to Thee for guidance, that all things is in harmony with Thy will. We ask Thee to be with the leaders of the nation, guide their decisions, and help us that we might have peace and prosperity worldwide. We thank Thee for all the other things that we enjoy daily, that help us if we ever remember that all things we have come from Thee. I ask Thee to go with us now as we go into the further exercise of this service. Forgive us when we fail. I ask to give us a home in heaven with Thee. In all things Thy will be done. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you'd like to mark the Song of Invitation, the number 207. 207. Once you have that marked, if you would turn to 621. 621. This will be our song before the lesson. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what a peace divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. Safe and secure from all harm.
All right. I sure enjoyed our vacation Bible school these last few weeks, and hope all the kids got some good things out of that. And if this situation continues on, and it looks like it's going to, where it's going to be a while before we can have classes again, we'll try to do something like that as we go along. We'll make sure our young folks have lots of encouragement through all of this, just like the rest of us. But tonight we're going to go back to our series on the heroes of faith that we had been studying from in Hebrews chapter 11. And last time we were together, we had worked our way down to talk about Joseph, which is in verse 22 of that chapter. So that's where we're going to pick it up tonight and talk about Joseph. Now, when I just say that, I know people get excited. Joseph is, without a doubt, one of our top 10, maybe top 5 people in the Bible to study about. What a great example of faith. And there's so many great stories that come out of the life of Joseph. And just never ceases to amaze me to study about everything that he endured in his life. So there are lots of greatest hits that come out of the life of Joseph. My guess would be that the moment that is actually mentioned in Hebrews 11 would not be in the first handful of stories you would pick from Joseph's life. But it is a significant event, even if it is a somewhat overlooked event from the life of Joseph. We're going to talk about some of the greatest hits, but only to see how they build up to what is actually mentioned in Hebrews 11:22. Tonight's lesson is about Joseph's bones. And his bones say something quite significant about what real faith can survive and endure to the glory of God. Hebrews 11:22 says, "By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones." In the great Faith Hall of Fame, the great testament to the faith of Joseph is the arrangements that he made for the burial of his bones. This, among anything else from his life, is what the New Testament specifically mentions to capture the real influence of this man. Now, what in the world is this talking about? I don't know if you're even familiar with this part of Joseph's life or not. You probably are. But just in case it's been a while since you've studied about this moment in his life, let's go back to Genesis for a moment here. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 50. And let's read what exactly this verse is talking about. Beginning in verse 22, Genesis 50, the last chapter of Genesis, the Bible says that so Joseph dwelt in Egypt. Now you know that part of Joseph's life very well. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But you remember how he was sold into slavery by his brothers. And because of that, he ended up in Egypt. He ended up a slave to Potiphar. And then he ended up in prison. But then also, when Pharaoh had some dreams, Joseph was brought before him to interpret those dreams. And because of that, he ended up second in command in Egypt, which was part of the providence of God, because during the time of famine, Joseph's family, his father Jacob and his brothers, had to come to Egypt for food. And because of that, the entire family ended up in Goshen, in Egypt. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt. He was 17 when he was sold into slavery. That means he spent about 93 years of his life in Egypt. All of his adult life was lived in Egypt. But in spite of that, he never became an Egyptian, per se. And that's what this is really all about. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. Lots of children, grandchildren around him, and very happy, very peaceful life. At least that's the way it ended up for Joseph. It certainly didn't start out that way, but that's the way it ended up. And as he gets to the end of his life, verse 24 says, Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying. But God will surely, notice that word, surely. You'll notice that word in several of the verses that we're going to read tonight. God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which He swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely, there it is again, visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, this just wasn't a suggestion. He didn't say, I would prefer to be buried in a cemetery in the land of Canaan. This wasn't just a personal preference. He forced them to take an oath before him. He forced them to make a binding promise and agreement. You are going to leave Egypt, and when you do, take my bones with you. Don't leave my bones here in Egypt. Take my bones back to the promised land and bury them where Abraham is buried, where Isaac is buried, where his father Jacob was buried. You are surely coming out of Egypt, and when you do, take me with you. Now that was a great statement of faith. And it was an oath that the people took seriously. Even though it was hundreds of years later. Go over to Exodus chapter 13 now. In the first 12 verses of Exodus, we read about Moses. We read about the 10 plagues that were brought upon Egypt in order to rescue God's people. And all of that culminated, of course, with the Passover and the death of the firstborn. And that was finally the plague that broke the will of Pharaoh to release God's people from slavery. Look at verse 19. As they are making their exodus, there was one thing they were sure not to forget. Verse 19. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. Of all of the things that Moses had to think about, leading millions of people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, the one thing he didn't lose sight of was to take Joseph's bones with him. They had made a solemn oath, and they would not forget it. God was surely bringing them out of Egypt, and they did just as Joseph asked them to do. Now, it would take some time. As you know, when they later came to Kadesh Barnea, the people listened to the 10 negative spies, and they refused to go up and fight for the cities, and because of that, they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years. And guess what? Joseph's bones wandered with them. They carried them around as long as they wandered in the wilderness. And then, when Joshua finally led the people in to conquer the Promised Land, guess what happened? Come over to Joshua chapter 24, the last chapter of Joshua, and look at verse 32. Joshua 24:32. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem, in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. This is hundreds of years later. But finally that dream of Joseph is fulfilled, and his bones are buried in the promised land where the other patriarchs were buried. Now, Hebrews 11:22 says, by faith, Joseph. And there are so many events from Joseph's life that could easily have been listed in Hebrews 11:22. It's almost impossible to touch any part of Joseph's life and not see Jesus in how Joseph conducted himself. In fact, the one thing that stands out about Joseph from any of the other people mentioned in Hebrews 11 is that I don't have any sins to talk about when it comes to Joseph. Now, I'm not trying to convince you he didn't commit any, but what I'm saying is, while the Bible tells us that Noah got drunk, and the Bible tells us that Abraham lied, and the Bible tells us about all the schemes of Jacob, it doesn't tell us about any sins committed by Joseph. Alan Webster wrote an article for House to House, Heart to Heart about Joseph. It was entitled 13 Chapters with No Sin. Because 13 chapters of Genesis talk about the life of Joseph. So what a remarkable man, what an impeccable character he possessed. We talk about Joseph's faith, we talk about a faith that overcame the obstacle of hatred from his brothers. You would have think that Jacob would have learned from Isaac and Rebekah how dangerous it is to show favoritism toward your children. But he didn't. He loved Rachel more than he loved Leah, and because of that, he loved Rachel's children more than he loved Leah's children. And Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel. And Benjamin would be the one that would come later. And so, because of that favoritism that Jacob showed toward Joseph, giving him the coat of many colors, his brothers hated him. And the Bible tells us in Genesis 39 that they could not speak peaceably toward him. I guess all brothers pick on each other. My brothers picked on me, and I'm sure everyone that's ever had a big brother has probably been picked on at one time or another. But what happened here, it goes much deeper than just sibling rivalry or brothers picking on each other. These brothers hated Joseph. And the way that they treated him was cruel and inhumane. And as you know, that culminated with an attempt to kill him. Fortunately, Reuben convinced them just to throw him in a pit and then sell him into slavery. Lots of folks can identify with Joseph here. Unfortunately, Joseph is not the last person to be mistreated by the people that you love the most. To be abused by someone who should love you and care for you. That's the kind of hurt and emotional pain that can cripple people. So this is no small thing to say that by faith, Joseph was able to rise above the way he was treated by his brothers. It did not wreck his own self-confidence in the man that he could be for God's glory. Now that's something amazing. That's something certainly that's worth mentioning and noticing. But it's not what's emphasized in Hebrews 11:22, is it? By faith, Joseph also resisted sexual temptation. You know that when he was sold into slavery, he went to work for a man named Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife cast her eyes upon him. She seduced him day after day after day. She tried to lure him into committing sexual sin. And somehow this teenage man, so far from home, having suffered so much already in his life, was still able to dig deep within himself and find the faith to resist all of these natural urges that a young man would have and resist those temptations. Look over at Genesis 39 for a moment. I want you to notice what it was specifically that motivated Joseph to resist Potiphar's wife. Look at starting in verse 7. It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, and nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now keep in mind where Joseph is. Keep in mind what has happened to him up to this point. Some people could easily look at Joseph's situation, if they were in his situation, and say, "Where was God when I was growing up with these brothers who made every day a living hell for me? Where was God then? Where was God out there in the field when they wanted to kill me? Where was God when I was down there in the bottom of that pit? Where was God when they pulled me out of that pit and sold me to the Ishmaelites? Where has God been during this time in Egypt when I've been working as a slave? I used to be the most cherished in my family. Now I'm the lowest slave on the totem pole. Where was God then?" Lots of people face their trials and their tragedies blaming God all of the way and using it as an excuse to make bad choices. It's not my fault that I do these things. It's what I've been through. It's what I've dealt with. If people had to go through what I've been through, they would make the same choices as I have made. Not Joseph. Joseph evidently never felt abandoned by God, and he surely would never abandon God himself. Even down there in Egypt as a slave, and Potiphar's wife tempted him, he said, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Folks, that's amazing. Think about the world that we live in today. In this current generation, you have two young people that keep themselves pure and do not commit any sexual sin until, that do not commit any sexual act until the day that they marry. That's a remarkable thing, is it not? That is a great testament of faith to have such devotion to God that you would commit yourself to that even in spite of everything going on around us. Sometimes we're better at making excuses than we are making commitments. "Oh, but the world has changed." No, it hasn't. The world we live in today was no different than the Egypt that Joseph lived in. And the temptations that we face today are no different than what Potiphar's wife was trying to do to him. It's all the same. But what we can learn from Joseph is that faith is being so aware of the presence of God that you commit yourself to not doing anything that would offend Him. That's a great testament of faith. But it's not what Hebrews 11:22 emphasizes, is it? Keep going. You know how Potiphar's wife reacted to Joseph. She lied about him. She grabbed him. He left his cloak in her hands. He ran away. She made up this story about things that he had not done. Because of that, Joseph ended up in prison. I've often wondered whether or not Potiphar really believed her story or not. This is just my curiosity, but I've often wondered if he really believed her, why wouldn't he have him executed? It certainly wouldn't be unusual for that to happen, and Potiphar certainly had the power to see it done. I think everyone knew that Joseph had not done what his wife claimed that she did. But it didn't stop him from ending up in prison, did it? And still the Lord was there blessing him and watching over him. And remarkably, even in that prison, he doesn't lose confidence in what God can do. Look at Genesis 40, verse 8. Pharaoh's butler and baker ended up in prison with Joseph, and they each had these dreams. The butler had a dream about a vine with 3 branches, and it bore plentiful fruit, and the butler squeezed the fruit, the juice, into Pharaoh's cup. The baker had a dream about a basket with bread, and the birds came, ate the bread, and they were disturbed by these dreams. They came to Joseph about it. And verse 8 says, they said to him, we have each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. Joseph survives the first tragedy with his brothers, only to get sold into slavery. But somehow he pulls himself up off the ground, and he musters the faith to go on, only to get kicked back down to the ground again and end up in prison. And yet somehow he musters to pull himself up off the ground again. And you see in this statement right here, he has lost no confidence in God whatsoever. This is the point where you expect to hear a young man say, well, I used to believe that God could help you in situations like that, but I'm not so sure anymore. If you're looking for any kind of questions or any kind of doubts like that in Joseph, you won't find them. God can answer your dream. God can show you the way. God can give you the answers that you seek. And that's exactly what happened. The baker would be killed. The butler would be restored to his position with Pharaoh. Joseph said to the butler, when you get back to Pharaoh, please remember me. Please tell him my story. Surely he can help me. And what did the butler do? 2 years he forgot all about Joseph. Left him sitting in that prison. Still, Joseph hasn't lost any confidence in God, has he? And because of that, by faith, Joseph saved his family from starvation. I would love to spend a lot of time going back over these stories. Some of my favorite in Scripture, but you're familiar with these stories about how the famine came and how Joseph's brothers ended up in Egypt looking for food, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And you know, this is a pivotal crossroads because, you know, Joseph, he has the power to do whatever he wants to do with them. If he had wanted revenge, he could have had it, but he chose to turn the other cheek instead. Come over to chapter 50 and look at verse 15. Now this is sort of after the fact, after Joseph has revealed to his brothers and everyone comes down to Egypt and they've spent some time there. And then it's even after Jacob dies. But it really captures to me the spirit of Joseph in this passage. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. So they sent messengers to Joseph, saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Evidently heartbroken that they would still doubt his love and capacity for forgiveness. They're afraid that now that Jacob's out of the way, he'll get his revenge. And Joseph wept that they even thought such a thing about him. And his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we are your servants. Joseph said to them, Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? Faith just comes dripping from everything that Joseph said. Vengeance is God's business, not ours. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord, Romans 12. Vengeance is not our business, it's God's business. And Joseph recognizes that here. Am I in the place of God? It's not my job to give you the vengeance that you deserve, or you might have deserved at one time. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for what? For good. In order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid, for I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. The same brothers who could only speak evil concerning him growing up are now the brothers that he speaks kindly to. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, or God used it for good. Long before Paul would write, all things work together for good, Joseph believed it and lived by it. And all of the tragedy that he went through, at the end of the day, he saw that because of that, he was in place to save his family from starvation. And because he saved his family, God's promise through Abraham would continue on. And so he was thankful. Even with all of the pain that he went through, he was thankful that God would use him in order to bring about His will. All of these things are great examples of faith. A testament to the will of this man to believe in God. And yet they're not the one that's mentioned in Hebrews 11:22. Hebrews 11:22 says, By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Well, the reason I believe this last example of faith is so important and so worthy of notice in this text is because it's really a culmination of everything that Joseph went through up to this point. Life had kicked him to the ground so many different times that it just could not shake his belief that God was going to do what He said He would do. Go back to Genesis 15 for a moment here. You see, even before any of this took place, God had spoken of it to Abraham. Genesis 15 verse 13, just on the heels of renewing this promise that God had made to Abraham, it says, Then He said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. That's Egypt. And they will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. That's the 10 plagues. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. That's the Exodus. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So all of this is going to take place after Abraham is long gone. But God revealed that He was already aware that there would be this period of time in which His people would go far away into a foreign land. They would be there 400 years. They would be afflicted during the time that they would be there, and then God would rescue them out. And as God gave that promise to Abraham, that promise was passed down to Isaac, that promise was passed down to Jacob, and then Jacob passed that promise down to Joseph. And in everything that Joseph went through in his entire life, he evidently never stopped believing that. So much so that he made a covenant. Let me skip ahead here a little bit. He made a covenant with the people that they would take his bones and bury them in the promised land. You've heard of the pyramids, right? Who hasn't? And you know how significant a proper burial place in Egypt would be. All of the expense and all of the effort that was put into building up this monument for their respected people to be remembered and to be buried. Now Joseph was in second in command of Egypt at the very height of its power and its wealth and its prestige. I don't know if they would have built a pyramid for Joseph, but they would have built something along that line for him. Some great monument, something very extravagant. But even after all of this time that he spent there, you can see that means nothing to Joseph. He would rather his bones be buried in an old cave covered with moss in the promised land than to have his bones kept in some coffin in a pyramid in Egypt. That is a great testament to his faith. John Phillips, see if I can find this. John Phillips wrote something I thought was pretty interesting about Joseph. He said, quote, "Look at the old man Joseph lying on his golden couch, surrounded by all the wealth and luxury of Egypt. It was the greatest country of antiquity, and Joseph had occupied a position of absolute power, second only to the Pharaoh. From the spacious windows of his mansion, he can see the waters of the Nile, the longest river on earth. Every comfort and convenience that ingenuity can devise and money can buy has been at his command. He had lived like one of the lords of the land, with pleasures and treasures of Egypt laid at his feet, and yet he cared little for them." Like Moses later, he lived in Egypt, but Egypt never lived in him. And I wonder just what the presence of those bones must have meant to the people. Think about all those years they were working as slaves. They could see where Joseph's bones were kept in Egypt, and they would remember. Joseph said, "One day we're getting out of here. One day God's going to lead us out of here. One day God's going to take us to the promised land." Like Hebrews 11:4 says, "Of Abel he being dead yet speaketh." That was true of Joseph's bones for many years. And in fact, I think we can say that Joseph's bones even continue to speak to us today. And they say to us three things that I hope we'll leave here tonight remembering on our minds. God will bring you out. God will bring you through. And God will bring you in. No matter how bad life got, Joseph continued to believe that. God would bring him out of the trouble that he was going through. God would bring him through all of the pain that he had to endure. And God would bring him in to that place of rest that he had promised. He believed that. I pray that we leave here tonight with Joseph's bones on our mind. And a reassurance that God will do the same for us. Let me close by reading Romans 8:31 through 39, and then the lesson will be yours. "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long, we are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall ever be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. He will bring us out, He will bring us through, and He will bring us in. We come to a close here tonight. We extend the Lord's invitation to anyone who needs to respond. Whatever your need is tonight, we are ready and we are eager to help in whatever way we can. So if you wish to respond, why not come now? As we stand, as we sing.
Would you live for Jesus and be always pure and good? Would you walk with Him within the narrow road? Would you have Him turn your burden, carry all your load? Let Him have His way with thee. His heart can make you what you ought to be. His love can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul and you will see what's best for Him to have His way with thee. Would you have Him make you free and follow at His call? Would you know the peace that comes by giving all? Would you have Him save you so that you need never fall? Let Him have His way with thee. His heart can make you what you ought to be. His love can cleanse your heart and make you free. His love can fill your soul and you will see what's best for Him to have His way with thee. Would you in His kingdom find a place of constant rest? Would you prove Him true each providential test? Would you in His service labor always at your best? Let Him have His way with thee. His heart can make you what you ought to be. His love can cleanse your heart and make